Hello, friends. On this glorious day in drink history, my guest is Virginia Miller. Ms. Miller is a food and drink writer with a resume that includes being the San Francisco, Northern California editor of Zagat, food critic of the San Francisco Bay Guardian, freelance contributor to Eater, Grub Street, 7x7 Magazine, Whiskey Magazine, Liquor.com, and more. And today she is the vice president of content and senior managing editor at Table 8. When she's not writing, she's judging, speaking, consulting, or more likely experiencing the many bars and restaurants she writes about. And the best place to start exploring her work is probably her website, theperfectspotsf.com. To say she's a cultural overachiever is an understatement. And as someone who has had the opportunity to dine with her at a restaurant, I can say with great confidence that she takes her craft very seriously. She's best described as either passionately obsessed or obsessively passionate, and the culture is fortunate to have her enthusiasm. Let's do this. This episode of the Educational Drinking Show is sponsored by Junipero Gin, which is the original American craft gin going back to 1996 and the pioneering work of Fritz Maytag, which also makes it the gin of San Francisco. At 98.6 proof, Junipero is a bit stronger than most gins and perfect in your favorite gin cocktail. Good stuff. And now it's my great pleasure to share with you my interview with Virginia Miller, food and drink writer extraordinaire.
I'm going to Taiwan in August.
They make whiskey.
I know. Kavalan, I know.
Are you going to make it to the distillery?
I would like to. Yeah, I hope so. This one's actually a food press trip, so hopefully I can slip away or stay on a little bit.
It's not that far from Taipei.
That's what I'm hoping, because we're going to be Taipei-based.
And it's one of the best visitor centers in the entire world for whiskey. They're renowned for it.
I know, and I love the whiskey, and I've had dinner a couple times with I'm going to space out on his name at the moment, but he's so wonderful.
Oh, Ian?
Yeah, Ian. He's
Chang.
so wonderful, yes.
Yeah.
And he's always said, come visit anytime. So hopefully I can make time for that.
Yeah. Have you been to Taiwan?
No.
It's amazing.
I'm so excited.
Yeah.
You've been with Gavilan, right?
I've been once.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of Vancouver in a way. It's very much Asia, and you know, you're in Taiwan, but it's very laid back, and there's a certain American feel to it. It's just really easy.
Yeah.
Like Japan feels like such another world.
It is. It's so much work, but I think that's what I've never worked so hard for a trip as Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a very long list, as I always do, of cocktail bars and restaurants I had to hit, and places that I had Japanese friends call ahead of time and reserve for me, because you can't get in otherwise.
Yeah.
You can't get in if you speak English or if you're calling from a U.S. number. So I had Japanese friends call. I've never worked so hard, and the culture's difficult to break into, and there's an exclusivity, but it's also, there's such perfection, which has its dark side, and as a perfectionist I know about that dark side, but there's such perfection in Japan that just I think exists nowhere in the world, that they attain this kind of blissful level. There'd be these moments where I just, service, atmosphere, everything comes together in a way that I've never experienced anywhere in the world, and it almost feels like, I feel like the first night I got to Tokyo, and I hadn't been, I'd wanted to go my whole life to Japan. My best friend since I was a girl is half Japanese, half German. I always had this draw. But I got there that first night. It was raining. It had been a real hassle to get in. And I was kind of dreading the fact that, that not everybody speaks English. And it was already really hard to get around that very first night. And we went to this bar that I'd picked out that has been there for decades. And it has a bartender that's well known for 50 years. He's been there, this older gentleman. It was, how it is in Tokyo. It's like on some 7th floor of some high rise. And we get in there, and I'm kind of irritable and worried about the week. And it's about a 12-seat bar, maybe, just tiny. And the bartenders are in white jackets and serving perfect martinis and fizzes. And they have an incredible whiskey selection of vintage bottles from the 60s and 70s. Jazz was playing. One person was smoking down the bar. And I just looked at my husband and Dan, and I just said, I feel like I stepped into another universe. This is, when can we come back I mean, the first night, I was there a couple weeks, and the first night it was
Wow.
just like, when can I come back? It's transporting. I've never seen service down to glassware, down to everything. Just everything is so perfect.
It's amazing. I don't even know how they do it. They turn it into such a practice, a discipline,
Yeah.
an art, you know? It's almost meditative.
Yeah, exactly. It is meditative. And I think there's something about that I really relate to. There's almost a spiritual aspect to the perfection and the dedication, the pursuit of perfection.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is difficult, but I think the world could learn a lot from it. So as much as I don't want everywhere to be like that, I do think there's something that's really inspiring about the level, and even just the level of respect. You know, whether they're letting you in or not, there's a certain level of respect they're always going to give you. Even if you walk into 7-Eleven there,
Yeah.
there's like the service and the respect level that's
Totally.
there's no tipping culture, and yet they, you know, they don't need to. They would never slag on the service just because you're going to tip them or
It's
not.
a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's there's a lot to learn from that kind of service and hospitality. Yeah. So,
Have you been to Bar Benfitic?
oh yes. One of my favorites, which
How would
I've
you
written
describe
about
it?
a few times.
How would you describe it to someone that hasn't been there?
You know, similar thing where it's intimate up on a high rise. There was this weird aspect to me where I felt like I was in colonial America. There was all this wood, like rustic wood that felt like a tavern, but then it was colonial era paintings. And yet it wasn't a tavern in the sense that it was comfortable, but then there was something very upscale about it. And, you know, the head bartender there, he's in a white jacket, and he pulls out this probably 500-year-old distilling book, huge, massive, with, you know, fading pages, crumbling on the edges. And he says, I can distill things for you here at the bar. You know, there's this absinthe recipe from a few hundred years ago, and I'd like to make that for you at the bar. And then he brings out all these herbs and this little, almost looks like a siphon, like you have for Japanese coffee. And he starts, let me just make you this, my own fresh herbal absinthe. And then he followed that by making his own root beer right in front of me as
Whoa.
well, with all these herbs. Just so it's like this colonial drawing room, half rustic, half elegant, only fits a handful of people. And the thing that just blew my mind is you'd go to bar after bar like this, and you'd think, if this was in New York or London or San Francisco, it would just be mobbed. You'd have to make reservations to try to get in. And you go to these otherworldly places there, and they're just mellow and quiet, and there might be a couple empty seats. And you think, how can this be? This is one of the best bars in the world.
Yeah.
And I just kind of walked in.
I describe it in one word: wizard.
Yes.
Very wizardly.
He's very wizardly.
I don't know. Is wizardly a word?
Now, I am not sure if the ly, I'm not sure if wizardly
You
is
knew
a
what I
word.
meant.
I know exactly what you meant.
Of a wizard-like nature.
Because that's exactly the way he is.
Yeah.
It's magic. It's potions.
Yeah.
He's creating that in front of you.
Yeah. We're doing a short film here, and it's going to be, I don't know when we're releasing it, in the next month or two, but it's all about Japanese bartending.
Oh, wow.
And man, it's fun to film. It's so cool.
You went to Gen Yamamoto's bar as well?
No, we only made it to 5 and only
Okay.
2 in Tokyo.
Oh,
so we
that's it?
did Benfitic and Bar Trench. And
Okay.
then,
Trench is cool.
Yeah. It feels like you're in Paris. Or
It
something.
does. And with a coffee bar aspect as
Yeah.
well during
So
the day.
cool.
Very
Yeah.
cool. And hipster, your young kind of hipster Japanese
With the
bartenders.
Clockwork Orange hat and
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
So cool.
Long hair, a little mullet sometimes, and suspenders. You know,
Yeah.
you get some of that bit. But that's a great one. Well, again, Yamamoto was another very special one that was
Yeah.
very sacred and intimate and quiet, almost museum-like quiet, and yet it's still comfortable. But one little bar as well, and he has maybe less than 10 spirit bottles behind the bar, and they're all spaced, just set up. It's just whatever he wants to feature at the moment. Very rare, you know, sometimes obscure, or maybe not even expensive, but just things you can't get in a lot of countries. And then he makes everything with seasonal produce and does cocktail tasting menus.
Of course he does.
And it's just it's less than 10 people, and you
Yeah.
sit at this beautiful rustic wood bar that looks all hand carved, or like someone took a tree and maybe not carved at all. It's just like a natural tree, this beautiful bar. And you just sit there, and he makes these tasting menus of cocktails that are just will blow your mind. And he'll use different Japanese fruits and produce and whatever's in season, and do a little mini tasting menu with exquisite barware and trays with flowers on them. And It's unreal. I mean, just Japan's, that, and in the food side, it's the same. It's like one experience after the other. You go, I can't compare this to anything. Yeah. And I've been to a lot of places. I know you have too. It's like a lot of places around the world, a lot of the best bars around the world, and London, Berlin, and all those cities have amazing bars, but there's nothing quite like Tokyo. And it's not always the most cutting edge in terms of experimental cocktails.
Yeah.
But it's the most, I'd say certainly the most pristine, but the most unique as well.
Yeah.
It's really hard to compare to
Absolutely.
anything. Yeah.
When did you write your first professional article as a writer?
It was 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's when I started my own site, and The Perfect Spot. And it was just a little thing that, my whole life I've been a writer, and actually with volumes of journals. I have over 50, a library of over 50 that I've written, my whole life. I always say when it's time to write the book.
Like a diary?
Yeah. I've got over 50 volumes, like a bookshelf of my journals.
Wow. Do you go back and read them?
I do sometimes, and it's kind of eye-opening.
Wow.
Scary, eye-opening, wonderful. It certainly gives you a lot of perspective. It's all there. It's cataloged, for better or for worse. And I wrote a lot of poetry growing up, so I always wanted to be a writer. And in fact, since I was age 5, I told people that I was such a literature lover. I told people I would be an author when I grew up. So I was very old school. I've always been old school too. Old movies, classic music, jazz, blues, whatever. I've always been that girl. Classic country. So I wrote all these journals, and it was one of those funny things where the last 15 years I've been so obsessed with finding where to go, what to eat, what to drink. And the more I got into it, the more I'd geek out, the more I wanted to know not just the ingredients in the cocktail, but the spirit behind it. Well, what goes into that? How is that made? So after a while, just everyone was coming to me, where to go, what to do all the time. And friends were sending friends, and strangers were coming to me. I was starting to spend a lot of spare time doing it. And that's when my husband, Dan, just said, you're a writer. Why don't you just do a website or a newsletter and write about this, and then just send people the link, because you're spending too much time on this. You're not getting paid for it. Just do it. And I was like, well, it's true. So it's funny. I always wanted to be a writer, but I never thought I'd be a food and drink writer. So what's funny is 6 weeks after I posted my first couple articles on The Perfect Spot, a friend sent me something on Craigslist about a place in Boston looking for writers to cover the scene in San Francisco. And it paid some measly sad amount, like $15 an article or something like that. I literally submitted my website as a resume, and I'm thinking, there's a couple articles on here. This will never go. And they called me back, and they hired me for San Francisco, and it was my first freelance gig. And I was as shocked as anyone. And then that kind of led to a couple more. And then within a year, I got a position at The Guardian. And it was kind of the same thing where they said, oh, you have your website. We'll maybe let you write something on occasion for us, see how that goes. And so I did, and they liked my first couple articles. And within a year at The Guardian, they gave me a weekly column. And so then I started doing that, and it quickly became dining and drink.
What year would that have been?
That would have been 2008.
Cool.
Yeah, 2008, 2009. And then a couple years into that, their dining critic of 13 years left, and they gave me that position. So I had the full page in the paper every week, pretty old school, but wonderful, as well as online. And then the drink side just kept increasing for me. I just became obsessed. Like I said, it started with cocktails. And places, even back 2008, places like, it started here, I'd probably say around the time Bourbon and Branch opened, and 10 years, 2005 when I really started getting into it. But then I went to New Orleans in 2008 and sat with Chris McMillan there at his bar. One of the best in the world.
One of the best.
And when, and I remember sitting there one night and ended up staying for 2 hours just talking to him, and then came back a couple nights later and did the same. And he was literally like, I only make a handful of cocktails, but I'm going to make the best mint julep or the best aviation you've ever had. I'm just going to perfect it. And
his Ramos.
Yeah, his Ramos. Oh my goodness. And his Absinthe Suissesse.
Whoa, that's
what
cool.
Was that?
We just lost a headphone amp.
Okay.
It was the gods agreeing with our assessment of his Ramos Gin Fizz.
Yes, it was almost a yes.
It's amateur hour here with the equipment. But that's perfect, because I wanted to quickly ask you, writer influences. Who are some of your big influences in terms of writers?
Oh, goodness. Well, talking about food and drink, I mean, I do have to go way
Or anything.
Anything. Okay, good. All right, good. Because I have a lot of favorite writers. I'm a big reader, like obsessive. Even when I'm at my busiest and I'm traveling the world and I'm working 7 days a week, I still read about a book a week.
Nice.
And if I have a little more breathing room, I read 3 or 4 in a week.
Wow.
I've always been a huge reader. So I have a lot of favorites. A big poetry fanatic, like I had mentioned before. Denise Levertov is kind of a lifelong favorite of mine. Mary Oliver, feels cliche to say, but Pablo Neruda for sure. So I love all that sort of thing. And then in my younger years, a lot of literature, but as I'm older, I probably read more nonfiction than anything. And I really get into everything from biographies to I'm actually, music's one of my great passions, so I read a lot of biographies of musicians and of writers. So since childhood, I'd say on the literature side, I'm all about Middlemarch, and that was one of my all-time favorite books. And so I've read lots of bios on George Eliot and her amazing life under a man's name. So I loved a lot of women like that. Was very inspired by them. And what's funny is, being back to that journaling, I always love reading people's diaries. So it's like, even Anais Nin, she has that, like, the most comprehensive journals her whole life. I've read them all. I've read that for a lot of people. I'll go back and read their journals or their letters, and I really get into that. But then I get into, like, really on the spiritual side too. I'll read monks and mystics and philosophers.
Yeah.
Thomas Merton's one of my all-time favorites. Read a lot of his stuff and his poetry and his journals, so I get into it all. But when I moved to San Francisco 15 years ago, on the food side, Patricia Unterman, who goes way back on the food writing side here in this city, her book was like my Bible.
Which book was that?
It was, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget the exact title, but it was literally like a list of restaurants, cafes, bars, neighborhood by neighborhood. And I used it kind of as my guide and checked it off until I went to every single place in the book. And I did eventually. And it was funny that I eventually became the editor for Zagat, because I did the same with the Zagat guide as well. And I would just mark off everything until, I'm like, hundreds of restaurants later, over the years, I did go to everything eventually.
So you started out as this avid reader and a fan of writing. Before, it seems like you got into being a food writer. How did your passion for reading and these authors influence you as a writer? Was your food writing just totally pragmatic, or did that other influence find a way into the writing you did?
I feel like it's interesting you bring that up, because I feel like ultimately that's where I'm headed or want to head. There are books I have always wanted to write, and it is amazing how I kind of see them now as maybe a mixture of the very personal and spiritual with drink and food and my journeys around the world. I see that coming together in a way I never envisioned. But it has been somewhat pragmatic. And I think that's one thing that's been helpful for me, is because I've always been, even though I'm very social and an extrovert and comfortable meeting anyone around the world, traveling around the world by myself. I've done it even for months at a time by myself, and I'm okay with that. When it comes to sharing writing, it gets so personal. And I was in these writing groups. I was in a writing group at Berkeley for a while that I was kind of doing off hours after work, and just every time I had to read or had my piece critiqued, I just get sick to my stomach. But I was sharing all these very personal things that I was writing, personal experiences. So to have it critiqued, even though it was supposed to be just to make me technically better, it felt so personal. I'd just be raw for days afterwards. So it was funny how food and drink helped me get out there more, and it helped me, I don't want to say it was to hide behind, but it helped me to write about someone else instead of myself, and to write about what I was discovering. Who's creating this? What drinks? What food are they making? What's exciting me now? Okay, I've been to 50 different Spanish restaurants in California. So what is the best and why? Compare and contrast. I've been to Spain a few times. Compare and contrast. Like even just all that analysis, I think it gave me a focus and a way to get out there without it being like, oh, here's my journal. Here's my soul. Why don't you stomp on it? And I think what I envisioned writing early on was so personal. I just couldn't start there.
Yeah. So you're working towards that.
I hope it's coming, and maybe no one cares, but I think there's some more personal aspects for me to weave in the future. So I do see it coming together. I do see it building, but I think I've always been into those really kind of, like I said, even the fact that I love to read people's letters and journals, that kind of soul searching sort of reading and seeing inside someone's daily life and mind has always really intrigued me. So it's kind of interesting how food and drink gave me a safe place. And then over the years, as I started, even when I was at The Guardian, I started writing for a bunch of places, from 7x7 magazine to so on. And then I started doing national stuff, and it just kept growing. Working with so many different editors has helped sharpen me, and even having to write in different voices for different publications or different styles. So I feel like all of that has really been helping me in ways that I never expected, when I kind of thought, oh, I'll just come out with this really personal book. I had hoped in my 20s and do that, but I'm like, no, it's kind of really grateful for this, and it's unexpected. And food and drink is such a passion, and to me it is a spiritual act in a way, because I really ascribe to the sensual experience of the spiritual. And I feel like every time I drink in a foreign country or at home with good people around a table, and I'm drinking what they drink and eating what they eat and experiencing their culture through what this distiller has been making his or her whole life, or that their family's been making for generations, I feel really connected on a broader spiritual level. I feel connected to history. I feel connected to other cultures, and that's always been a passion too. Travel from the first time I left the country, I knew I was hooked. I knew it was going to be, every time I can get out, I will. And I'm grateful that food and drink has also led me there, because I've gotten to know so many countries and people so much better. And it's exciting to feel like, I'm sure you experience this too, but to feel like you can travel around the world in a lot of cities and have friends in many cities, or have friends of friends who will say, oh, you're going to Taipei for the first time. I have some people for you to meet who are in our industry, some other writers or other people in drink and food. And you go and you have this community already around the world, and it's so good. So I never thought this would lead to bring all my passions together in so many ways, but it really has. It's kind of been a dream come true, and it was a career change. I was in HR before.
Where the excitement is.
Yeah, exactly. And hiring and firing people and interviewing and employee relations counseling and all kinds of crazy stuff at Genentech. I mean, it's the weirdest that I've come from, but this is what I would do in my off hours. I'd explore places just obsessively, and always writing, always.
Did you or do you follow other food and drink writers and kind of take cues from them? And also, what's your perspective on food and drink writing as an art today?
It's kind of, it's getting tougher and tougher all the time as publications have, word count shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and a lot of publications have shut down, including The Guardian, that was so good to me all those years. A lot of things have shut down. Papers are going away. Magazines are disappearing. So there is a discouragement sometimes to see the dumbing down, and that in a lot of ways, people really only want the Instagram shot. They don't really want to hear about it, or the origins of the dish, or what went into the drink. It's just, oh, it's a cool shot. Like it. Heart it, thumbs up, whatever. Or, the Twitter 140 characters. So I feel on one hand, the state of things is kind of less artful than it's ever been. But at the same time, you see things rising up through that, and publications like Lucky Peach and so on, where that are more long form and people are trying to say more. I don't know where it's all going to land, but I kind of hope there's a place and an audience. I see it as a smaller audience that does crave a little more depth and content and to dig in. But I know I'm kind of the same as anyone. It's even in the early years, I followed so many more food and drink writers, and I still do, but I don't have time to read all their articles because I'm busy writing so many, and I'm busy editing a whole team of writers, and I'm, busy traveling constantly. So I understand why it's hard to keep up, and I understand why it's kind of dumbed down in that way. Even social media, the noise, it's all louder than ever. So I understand people don't have time to dig in, but I think it's a great loss. And I hope that some of these niche publications and even just different ways of maybe finding different forms of media and communication will continue to grow for people who are hungry for substance instead of shallowness. Because I think there's a lot of shallowness. And I think that's one thing I was going to say, getting into writers more too, is in the early days, I kind of went through this obsessive phase where I read all the pioneers. Like I read, Craig Claiborne, like the first official restaurant critic that ever existed in the 60s, and New York Times, but I read every bio about James Beard. I read all these different things from the early days, and it was similar with drink. I mean, back in the day, I remember when there was only a handful of really great cocktail books, but I'd go back to the ones from the 50s or beyond, and Bernard DeVoto, right? I'd read the Cocktail Hour and like all those books. I'd go back and read all this old stuff and go, I kind of would love to see some of that come back. He just wrote that ode to the cocktail, like how sacred the cocktail hour is when the toil of work ends and you have that martini in hand and you then usher into the evening, and it's a sacred hour. And I just thought, it's a beautiful book. It's a short little book, and it's so beautiful. So I kind of long to see some of those things come back, even just more tributes to drink and food that aren't necessarily critiques or even just a practical rundown. Here's what it is and what they do, but more of an ode to the experience. I don't know how it'll fit or if there's a hunger for that, but I long for it, and that's kind of a lot of the stuff I read in the old days, is like going back further. Of course, there's many great cocktail books going back to 150 or so years, but I like these kind of essay type books that I've found, or bios of the early day writers. And there was another one, and forgive me if I'm going to butcher it. He was a reporter, like A.J. Liebling, I think it was, from the 40s, or he was kind of like even in World War II, but he was traveling around for war reporting and ended up doing like food and different spots and things he would find.
Same difference.
Yeah, exactly. And I just loved reading his stuff too. It was always intriguing,
When you reflect on your body of work thus far, does anything stand out to you that you're extra proud of?
Well, there's such a volume. It's sometimes it's you get to the point where you're churning it out like a machine, and like when I was the full-time editor at Zagat, it was like okay, my quota was I had to do 15 articles a week. Sometimes you're just going and you're like, okay, you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But I do love some of the bigger pieces I've done. I sometimes like doing, I guess some people could call them roundups, but big features. Like even at The Guardian, I did a big cover piece one time on the 50 best bars in San Francisco. And I loved, this was a few years ago, and I had trouble narrowing down to 50 then.
Wow.
But it was so fun just thinking through every aspect, like iconic, historic, beer bar, cocktail bar, hole in the wall dive versus upscale. Like I was like, I got to cover it all. It's all got to be there. And just even vetting through those lists, I kind of love it. And then I'm proud of it in the end, going, there's still a few I would have liked to have included, but I do feel like this was comprehensive. This really covered a lot of the greats. If someone were to come in and dig in to this list, they're going to know what a special drinking city our city is. Currently, I just wrapped up a piece for liquor.com that's coming in a couple weeks. That's on the 23 essential bars of San Francisco. That was much harder. I think 23 was, and now, even the last few years, there's so many more, really essential bars.
Yeah.
So this one hurt because I had to leave out a lot of things. But I love those kind of projects. I also write every quarter for Distiller magazine, which is just more like industry, more for craft distilling and that side of things. But I do a feature on a different city every quarter. And I love doing those too, because I do really like to tie in the bars with the distillers and say, these are some of the bars doing the best things with interesting spirits in that city. And I'll write about 10 different bars, and then I'll interview one local distiller and one local bar manager in each city.
Cool.
And so I've done that for city, everywhere from Louisville to San Diego. I've done a bunch of different cities, and I've got more coming. Every quarter I do another one. So that's another project that I kind of love and am proud of.
I get the sense that you take experiential research very seriously.
I do.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I feel I kind of have a personal policy. If I haven't been, I don't write about it. If I haven't tasted it, I don't write about it. Because A, how can I recommend it? And B, what do I really have to say other than regurgitate something I'm finding online?
Mm-hmm.
And no disrespect, because I know how brutal the quotas and publications get and how sometimes you just got to churn out these roundups and these things that come from the top that you got to do. I understand it, but I know a lot of writers that will just say, you know what, I just need to get what I need to get in the roundups or to fill this material out in this article, whether I've been or not. And for me, yeah, obsessive or not, and yes, I am exhausted often, but I keep spreadsheets and I go to over 600 places a year. And I've been doing that for over 15 years. I've only been writing officially or professionally for 8. But for over 15 years, I've been building up that experience. And I'm like, to me, I do have to taste and see myself. And then that's what I'm telling you about. And sometimes for the publication, the piece has got to be pretty clinical and that's not going to come through. But I can still tell you I've been to that place in that roundup. I've been to those 10 spots that I included. And I've really thought through who I want to include and why. And it is very important to me. I don't think it's worth reading if someone's just kind of copying and pasting press releases or just going, oh, well, I heard that this barbecue place was good, so I'm going to include it. Yeah, that does make me think another piece that I really loved doing was for Whiskey Mag UK.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a feature on Japan after I went there. And I wrote about visiting Yamazaki and things like that I did. But it kind of I did a whole history on Japanese whiskey and some of the distilleries that are now closed. And, of course, the things that we know well about how it started and the father of all that, but which comes from this side of the woods here. So it's, there's all of that. But it was such a wonderful article to just have context. And the great part was I was writing about distilleries that had closed in Japan long before my time. And there's so many bars there that have bottles from 40 years ago that you can just get a pour of, that I was like, I actually have drank whiskeys from every one of these bars I'm writing about. Even if, of course, Chichibu, and I've had some of the card series a few times, which will probably never happen again. But I was blessed to have some of that 10 years ago even, and just go, oh, wow, now it's impossible to get.
Have you been to Miyagikyo or Yoichi?
No, I
you
would.
gotta go.
I know. I would love to go to. I'm a big Yoichi fan too, so I would love to go.
And the ramen up in Hokkaido is totally different.
That's my favorite style, the miso ramen, because I like that texture in the broth. I think it adds so much.
Yeah. So happy.
Oh, so you've been there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm dying to go.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I feel like next. So you went to Tokyo and then you went up to
Hokkaido and Sendai as well, which is where Miyagikyo is.
Wonderful.
Which is like this kind of weird metropolitan area that's not Tokyo, but just another city kind of north of there, and it's amazing.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
I would love to go. I need a lot more time in Japan, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but just even digging into that, putting the history of Japanese distilling in context was wonderful for me, because Scotland's another very favorite place of mine, and the Highlands just haunt me in my memory as well. So I love the connections between Scotland and Japan. There's so much that all ties together in this world. And
you've been to Cognac.
Oh, yes.
What?
Recently.
Okay, so what about visiting Cognac connected you to the spirit in a way that was different than not visiting it?
Yeah, Cognac surprised me. It was actually one of the most surprising and gratifying distillery trips I've had, which shocked me because I was kind of expecting just... Yeah, I mean, I had good expectations, but I'm thinking there's a lot of big money. There's so many limitations. It's a spirit that has, for better and for worse, has very strict regulations around it. So you can't get too experimental or crazy. I did bring home a few small batch distillers that are popping up around the area. A female distiller, Fanny Faugeray. I brought home these wonderful bottles, but it's still not the kind of place where you're going to get some really wacky out there spirit. The regulations are there, and everything has to be made within those regulations to be qualified as cognac. So I was kind of expecting a limited experience. And once you've seen dozens and dozens of distilleries around the world, you kind of start to feel like you've seen it all. It's not like when I went to Oaxaca and saw clay pot distillation, and that's mind blowing. It's this is hundreds of years old tradition. I'm seeing a pot in the mud and they're distilling that way. Or it's not like Peru, which was a whole other experience. I got to help distill there and actually work hands-on and do some blending. So I just kind of thought, it won't be like that. It'll be these beautiful distilleries and vineyards. It'll look a lot like what we have here, Napa and Sonoma and all our beautiful terrain here in Northern California. So I kind of thought I knew what to expect, and I got there, and there was such a romance that I didn't expect. And yes, I am a romantic, if that's maybe not obvious already with the poetry and the music and all the bit, the old world stuff. But there was such a romance, and certainly we had a privileged visit in that we got to stay at some of the old chateaus on the grounds of some of these different distilleries. So, you stay in a 1700s or 1800s house or chateau. You certainly are soaking up some of the history that way. At Martel, I believe it was, we were in the dining room having dinner in the house, and they had the most stunning hutch I've ever seen in my life. And I'm just kind of touching this hand-carved wood going, this is so amazing. I said, this is the most beautiful hutch I've ever seen. And they said, well, yes, it was a gift that Napoleon gave to Josephine. And there's 2 of them. And one's in a museum in Paris and one's here in our dining room. And I just went, okay. You can just shoot me now. And I'm just sitting there having dinner in that room. And again, for me, it wasn't about the bling. It wasn't about, it's Napoleon. It was that historical context of being able to experience that, again, as a literature lover and an old world, kind of an old soul. I've always been an old soul. I somehow felt connected to the past of cognac. And
sure.
A mind-blowing one was Otard, which is not imported into the U.S., but they make Doucet as well, and Doucet is imported into the U.S. So they have cellars in a castle that goes back 1,000 years, and it's right on the river there in in the very small city of Cognac. And we went down into those cellars, and that was something I'd never seen before. Was they had the literally like wet and dry, or humid and dry cellars, and the humid cellars were covered in mold. And they had the demijohns, they had the barrels and then the demijohns holding the cognac, and they were just covered in mold so thick. I mean, it was almost disgusting, but wonderfully so. I mean, you just walked in and it was like, if you had any asthmatic issues or breathing, you probably would have real trouble in there. It was just mold so thick. It was like a mountain of it covering everything. And then there was mushrooms growing on the walls. And you're in this 1,000-year-old castle in this cave, and just the smell, you can't begin to describe it. The mustiness is a whole other level of mustiness. And the smell of grapes aging in that kind of context, it doesn't smell the same as all the wineries I've been to, or as any other brandy or eau de vie that I've experienced. It's its own thing. So to even smell that, and in cognac they call those cellars paradise, and it's kind of appropriate. Name. And where they have their oldest juice essentially aging is usually paradise. So to go into those cellars in multiple at multiple chateaus, but especially, of course, that one in the 1,000-year-old castle. It was like, it's just, you can't replicate this.
It's so cool.
And you can make brandy elsewhere, or in the U.S., we have some fantastic brandy, particularly here in California. We have pioneering brandy makers that go back a few decades, but you still can't kind of replicate that history. And so to have that context, I fell in love with it in a whole different way. And I'd always loved Cognac Armagnac, but this was just another level.
Switching gears a little bit, San Francisco, bird's eye view of the drink scene. What do you see? Where's it headed?
Yeah, it's been fun watching it the last 10 plus years and closely cataloging and writing about it, and going everywhere dozens of times over. It was certainly, along with New York, was the pioneering city in the Renaissance of the last 15 years. So there are things I've seen here long before I've seen them anywhere else, and even sometimes in New York, and sometimes in New York vice versa. But these two cities, I think, have really led the way and done things I haven't seen elsewhere to bring this Renaissance. And even the first time, I remember back when Naya White was a regular bartender, just doing many sherry cocktails and bringing these rare sherries he'd bring back from Spain. And that was years ago, long before everyone was doing sherry. So there's these trends I've seen, and there's these moments in the last few years where I've gone, okay, now a lot of those greats like Naya and Brooke Arthur, and these people have moved on and they're brand ambassadors and they're not behind the bar anymore. And there's been these times where I've worried that, we're not innovating as much, and where's the next generation of leaders like that would come back and bring a whole category like sherry to a city and popularize it. So there have been these moments where I've worried about that it might be getting stagnant a little bit. But the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of exciting things again that have been ahead of what I've seen elsewhere. And I'm constantly traveling both internationally but also around the US. And as you know, most US cities have, if not a scene, a couple cool bars. And I still think there are things happening here that are precursors to what's coming elsewhere, and I don't see them happening elsewhere. And so they excite me, and it's been everything from Danny Louie, who's been one of my favorite bartenders since he was at Alembic and just totally behind the scenes and under the radar. One of the most talented, but just to see what he was doing at Chino, and even as a Chinese American, but he'd kind of pull from China, he'd pull from Japan, he'd put dashi broth in his cocktails, and he'd do, just such interesting miso cocktails, very interesting things, boozy boba with, and you'd have the tapioca balls and the whole bit, boozy boba slushy cocktails. He was doing that stuff a couple years ago, and now he's at Mr. Jew's doing really interesting. His cocktails, I went in and I'm thinking, okay, tea cocktails I've seen, but his tea cocktails are totally different than anything I've ever had. He has one on this initial menu because they just opened a couple weeks ago, where it's got a really beautiful jasmine tea as the base, and it's almost like you're drinking a jasmine tea that has booze as a backdrop. There's tannins and texture, and it's all that texture of the tea coming through. It's not the tea as an accent to the booze. It almost tastes the other way around. He's doing really interesting stuff on this new menu. And again, I haven't seen anyone. There's a few other people doing some interesting Asian influenced cocktails around the country, but I haven't seen anyone do it to the level that he's doing it, both in terms of fun and innovation. And from day one at Lazy Bear, I've loved what Nicholas Torres is doing there, and he's had some really innovative cocktails, and he was the first one I saw using Singani from Bolivia, which, Steven Soderbergh has brought to the US and is now becoming popular. But he was doing cocktails with that last May, before I even got my media sample and before things were sent out. He was already playing with it and doing gorgeous cocktails to showcase it. Similarly with Anthony at Murad, and Anthony at Murad is doing, Ras El Hanout spice blends and curry and milk cocktails, and playing with what Murad is doing himself in the kitchen. He's playing with that at the bar, and there's a lot of synergy between it. And he's doing some really innovative stuff. Also Cezanne, which I know is a fine dining restaurant, but a 3 Michelin star restaurant that's amazing. But you can just go sit at the bar. And also Anthony there as well, 2 different Anthonys. Anthony there is doing cocktails for $16 that are of the elegance of what I see in Tokyo and London. And they're just amazing. He does this fantastic off-menu gin and tonic where he does his own like sous vide and infusions with violets, with like fresh violet flowers from their garden, and then he will do a gin and tonic with that, with Nolet gin, so it's kind of already got rose petal floral aspect. And then when he pours the tonic in there, it almost luges, and it changes different colors of purple, and it's just beautiful. It tastes floral, looks stunning, does it in proper Japanese glassware, so paper thin glassware. And I just go, I'm not seeing this around the U.S. I've seen it internationally a few times, but even not that specifically. I think he's of that level. He's kind of what's happening in some of the most innovative places internationally. because even internationally, I'll have a lot that'll be innovative, but it doesn't always taste great. And I think that's one thing with San Francisco is our food culture is so rich and so deep, and we didn't just come along with this recent renaissance. It goes back 50 years. It goes back Alice Waters days. We've been farm to table since the 60s at least. It's that kind of thing. I think that feeds into more of the palate than one would expect from on our drink side even, where I think there is everyone I know that's into drink, whether they're on the wine side. I have a lot of close wine, sommelier friends and wine friends. Everyone has an impeccable food palate as well. And I see the same with the drink. And I feel like that goes into the balance. So sometimes I'll see this innovation, in other countries, but it still doesn't taste great, or the balance is a little off. Or I'll go, oh, well, they have gold flakes and they've infused all these spices and these different things, but it tastes a little weird. Or they put a special clarified milk in it, but it's actually coming out clumpy a little bit. I've even had that at some very notable London bars that I won't name, where I'm just shocked. I'm going, okay. And other times, London blows my mind, so it can go both ways. But I do think that palate here is very advanced. I mean, we were, drinking more Fernet than the rest of the, country combined 10, 15 years ago. And we were into bitter. We had that ability for bitter, or that interest in a bitter palate, and long before it was popular or trendy. And I think, the Bay Area, San Francisco, it's always had that kind of, both adventurous palate, but worldly palate. And so I think that does define a lot of what you see behind the bar as well. There's a sense of balance. And so I think there's some new innovation and bartenders to watch and people coming up. And there's some exciting things happening. I'm excited. Carrie Cormican and crew at Wild Hawk, which just opened 2 weeks ago, went and tasted through the menu there. And she's got this stellar lineup of bartenders. And she's got stellar lineup of some of the best female bartenders anywhere. And I can't wait to see what they're going to do. There's some serious talent behind that bar, from Christina Cabrera on. She's got all these amazing bartenders. I think they're going to do some innovative stuff as well and still keep it approachable. So there's lots to watch. I think there's a lot coming up, a lot that's changing, and new innovation. But of course, everyone's kind of over anything too flashy or fussy. So, I see the innovation, but I also see that sense of if it's not drinkable, if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. If it's too stuffy or precious, it's not worth doing. Yep. So thankfully, I think we're there too. Because even at Cezanne that I mentioned, it's a 3 Michelin star restaurant, but hospitality is so prime there. And even though you're at this fine dining restaurant, you still feel very comfortable at the bar, and they're playing casual music, and Anthony's a lot of fun, and their sommelier is great too, and they just put you at ease, and it's not stiff at all, which it can be sometimes in some parts of the world. So